Good evening, friends, colleagues and honoured guests. My name is Kathryn O'Leary and I'm the co-chair of the Scottish Arts and Humanities Alliance, as well as Assistant Vice Principal Dean of Arts and Divinity at the University of St Andrews. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Scottish Arts and Humanities Alliance, SAHA as we call it, it is a joint initiative of Scottish higher education institutions, the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities. It was established to give a public and collective voice to the arts and humanities in the context of higher education in Scotland and to promote the contribution of our disciplines to positive change in society, economic progress and cultural understanding. I'm delighted on behalf of the Alliance to welcome you to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for our first joint event with the United States Consulate General in Edinburgh. This evening's discussion is about Tartan Day, the history and future of the famous celebration of Scottish heritage in the US. Before we begin, a few words of housekeeping. I'd like to remind everyone of the RSE's fire safety and evacuation procedures. I think there may be a slide. There is a slide. So in case of a fire, please use one of the emergency exits and assemble outside the dome, which is located about 130 metres to your right if you exit the building by the front door. We don't need a slide anymore now, thank you. I'd like to thank colleagues at the RSC and the Consulate for their support, and in particular for Simone, SAHA's Comms and Policy Officer, for all the work she has done behind the scenes to make this event happen. But back to the business of this evening. Tartan Day is celebrated on April the 6th, at least in some countries, the date on which the Declaration of Arbroath was signed in 1320. Today is the 10th, so we're a few days out from the 6th, but still within Tartan Week. It's a celebration of Scottish culture, heritage and identity, and the global contributions made by Scottish people and the Scottish diaspora. Tartan Day is widely celebrated in North America, especially in the United States, where it was recognized by the US Senate in 1998, the House of Representatives in 2005, and the President in 2008. This year's New York City Tartan Day Parade was led with panache, if you saw it, by Scottish actor Alan Cumming. So, as I've already mentioned, this evening's event is organised in conjunction with the US Consulate in Edinburgh, and it is my very great pleasure to invite Consul General, Ms. Kathryn Porter, to tell us more about the significance of Tartan Day in the US. Kathryn.
So hello and good evening, everyone, or as we say where I'm from, good evening, y'all. It is really a pleasure and an honor to be here with you as we gather to celebrate, a little belatedly, Tartan Day, a day that recognizes the enduring connections between Scotland and the United States. I want to express my gratitude to the Scottish Arts and Humanities Alliance for organizing this event, and to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for hosting us, and of course to our distinguished panelists. To Murray Pittock, Leonie Bell, Billy Kay, and of course Kathryn O'Leary for sharing their insights on the history and future of this famous celebration. Tartan Day is more than just a recognition of Scotland's past and about the contribution Scottish Americans have made to the United States, though of course that is tremendously important. It is also a celebration of Scotland's ongoing influence, its diaspora, and its cultural legacy that continues to shape societies across the Atlantic and beyond. Tonight, we reflect on that history, but we also look ahead at how Tartan Day can continue to inspire and connect future generations. You'll no doubt know, as mentioned, that the idea behind Tartan Day is rooted in history, particularly the Declaration of Arbroath, which was signed on April the 6th, 1320, more than 700 years ago. The document was a declaration of Scottish independence, a passionate assertion of self-determination. Historians have often noted its parallels to the US Declaration of Independence, signed more than 450 years later. The idea that a people have the right to self-govern, to forge their own destiny, and to defend their freedom remains as powerful today as it was in medieval Scotland or revolutionary America. The recognition of Tartan Day itself is more recent history. As Kathryn mentioned, it was formally established in the United States in 1998 when the US Senate passed a resolution recognizing April 6th as National Tartan Day. That recognition was championed by Scottish American groups who understood the role that Scots and their descendants have played in shaping the United States. Today, it is commemorated with events across the US, from academic discussions to business events, concerts, and galas, of course culminating in a huge celebration of Scotland in a parade down Manhattan's 6th Avenue. Tartan Day is about heritage, but it is also about influence. Scotland's contributions to the world through innovation, entrepreneurialism, and culture are immense, and Scottish immigrants carried those influences across the Atlantic, helping to shape American history in profound ways. The Scottish Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, including David Hume and Adam Smith, helped lay the intellectual foundations for modern democracy and economics, concepts that would be crucial to the formation of the United States. Scots and their descendants have served as US presidents, including President Trump, and also Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt. They have played key roles in businesses, engineering, science, and literature. Andrew Carnegie, one of the most influential industrialists and philanthropists in American history, was born across the water in Dunfermline before making his way to the United States, to name just one of many examples. But beyond the famous names, millions of everyday Scottish immigrants, farmers, teachers, shipbuilders, and workers, brought their values of hard work, education, and resilience to the United States, shaping communities from coast to coast. Today, according to the most recent US Census, 5.3 million Americans claim Scottish ancestry, and it is estimated an additional 20 million have some Scottish ancestry. That number speaks to a cultural legacy that is still very much alive. As we celebrate Tartan Day, we also have an opportunity to consider what it means for the future. Heritage is not something that stays frozen in time. It is something that evolves, that is carried forward for each new generation. The success of Tartan Day depends on how we engage young people in this story, how partners in Scotland and the United States can make this celebration meaningful in the modern era. How do we connect the Scottish-American experience of the past with the Scotland of today? How do we tell this story in ways that resonate not only with those who have Scottish ancestry, but with people from all backgrounds who find inspiration in Scotland's history and traditions? Tonight's discussion will no doubt explore some of those questions, and I'm very eager to hear from my panelists, each of whom brings a unique perspective on Scotland's history, culture, and place in the world. Their insights will help us think about how we honor the past while ensuring that Tartan Day remains relevant and vibrant for years to come. So, as we mark this occasion, let us celebrate Scotland's lasting influence, reflect on the deep friendship between our nations, and look forward to a future where those connections continue to thrive. Thank you all again for being here, and I look forward to a very engaging discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists and welcome them to the stage. Murray Pittock is Bradley Professor and Pro-Vice Principal at the University of Glasgow and co-chair with me of the Scottish Arts and Humanities Alliance. Professor Pittock's books cover a variety of subjects, including English, history, art history, politics, and more recently, VR/XR. On behalf of SAHA, Professor Pittock gave evidence to both Holyrood and Westminster on Scotland's international strategy and highlighted that so-called traditional associations with Scotland, such as whisky, tartan, and golf, act as powerful hooks to the collective imagery and create interest worldwide. Professor Pittock is also a senior member of the Centre for Robert Burns Studies 2023 Queen's Anniversary Prize-winning team and author of the Pittock Report, a groundbreaking study of the economic impact of this important Scottish and international cultural figure. Leonie Bell is the director of the V&A Dundee, Scotland's Design Museum, which in 2024 hosted the wonderful Tartan exhibition. Leonie is a long-standing cultural leader in Scotland and a champion of the creative arts. In addition to her day job, she's an honorary professor of design at the Duncan of Jordanstone College of Art and Design, a Royal Society of Edinburgh Fellow, a Design Economy Ambassador with the Design Council, a member of the Bonnetmakers Craft, one of 9 incorporated trades of Dundee, a member of the Policy Evidence Centre for Creative Industries Advisory Board, and a trustee of the Edinburgh International Festival. Our third panellist is Billy Kay, writer and broadcaster, language activist, and author of The Scottish World, a book focusing on the global influence of the Scottish diaspora. His company, Odyssey Productions, has produced award-winning documentaries on Scottish cultural history, and he's also enhanced people's knowledge of the beauty and influence of the Scots language in Scots, the Mither tongue. In 2019, he was voted Scots Media Person of the Year at the Scots Language Awards in Glasgow. In November the same year, he addressed the 263rd annual banquet of the St. Andrew's Society of the State of New York. There, the Society gave him their Mark Twain Award for the promotion of Scotland internationally. We're delighted to have you all here with us this evening, and now we'll move on to some questions. Thank you. So, Murray, I'll start with you. The Consul General has given us some background into Tartan Day in the US. Could you maybe give us a little more about the history of Tartan Day and the links between Scotland and the US?
Well, there's a good question there, and I could spend a very long time on it and won't. That's to relieve you of that concern. So Tartan Day embedded in Tartan Day is one of the great invented traditions of the Scottish tradition in the United States, which is kirking the tartan, first developed in a 1943 sermon by Peter Marshall at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in DC. So, I mean, kirking the tartan is a key building block in the whole Tartan Day story. Which, of course, begins in Canada and Nova Scotia in 1987 and spills over. It's, first of all, Tennessee and North Carolina are the first 2 states to actually have Tartan Days before Trent Lott's Resolution 155 of 1998. So that's those things are a part of the way in which Tartan Day has come into being. The connection with the Declaration of Arbroath, which, like many things which are very flattering to Scotland, Scots have an instinctive dislike of, is, shall we say, not proven. But if I could just leave you, and at a very early stage in America's history, with quotations from John Witherspoon, Scotland has manifested the greatest spirit for liberty. Your history is full of their calling kings to account and dethroning them, alluding fundamentally to the way in which the Covenanting tradition addressed and developed from the Declaration of Arbroath. If you consider that there are 14 editions of the Declaration of Arbroath in circulation in the 18th century, and if you consider James Wilson's, founder of the Supreme Court's quotation, essential liberty which we are determined not to lose but with our lives, we might think it very unusual that he would make that quote without having any textual familiarity with the Declaration. So the Declaration is not proven. It's filtered through many things if it comes to the US Declaration of Independence, but it's a very important building block for the constitutional tradition on which Jefferson, Witherspoon, Wilson, and others drew in the late 18th and early 19th century. And as far as the outward manifestation of tartan goes, I'm just going to give you a quote and I know it's just across the border, but I have the figures. For the 1849 tartan sales from Fort Vancouver, they've just been audited, things are really slow there, 1,438 yards of Macduff, 1,119 of Clanranald, 965 of Royal Stewart, Argyll and Ancient MacGregor. So a total of 2 miles of tartan sold at Fort Vancouver, principally to First Nations customers in 1849. That shows you how long North America's love affair with tartan has been. And indeed, the Cree made a handsome markup by retrading tartan that they bought wholesale, bright colours being particularly preferred by Native Americans, to wider markets in the 19th century. So this, not to mention the one Scottish paramount chief and the 5 or 6 Scottish subsidiary chiefs of Native American groupings. So principally, of course, John Ross, paramount chief of the Cherokee, who got the Cherokee to subscribe for the West Highland potato famine, which was extremely innovative, in considering they just completed the Trail of Tears.
Great, thank you, Murray. I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes, but first I'd like to ask Leonie a question. So tartan is part of Scotland's very strong visual identity. Can you talk to us about this and about the very successful tartan exhibition that the V&A had last year?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I think some of you may have seen the exhibition when it was at V&A Dundee in 2023, which was our 5th birthday. So I suppose what we were thinking as Scotland's Design Museum, what would you use to celebrate 5 years of being a design museum? And we luckily knew of a professor of fashion thinking called Jonathan Ferris, who'd written a very seminal book on the relationship between tartan and fashion in 2008. So that gave us a bedrock of research, a foundation upon which we could root many other ideas and lines of research and curatorial inquiry. So we went for it. We thought, we go for it. It's V&A Dundee's 5th birthday year. There is no greater story we can tell that embraces so many ideas of Scotland in a coherent way, but allows there to be really true diversity within the telling of that story as well. So I suppose the simplest way is to maybe share what the exhibition achieved in the run, beyond being one of our most popular exhibitions and being well received by critics and historians of all backgrounds. We started off, you entered the exhibition and you were introduced to the concept of the grid, so the very basic, I suppose, textile architecture of the fabric. So I suppose we started to position the story of tartan as how does something from humble utilitarian roots, which very much is responding to what's at hand and underfoot in terms of the places that it was being made and why. I mean, it had a utility. And then what's the potential of the because on the one hand the grid is, you can see on Murray and I, not Billy, but we'll get him some tartan. You know, on the one hand it's a grid and it's simple but somehow it keeps giving life. So we started to introduce how can something with such grid structure and you know, the idea of sets continually be giving life to ideas of what Scotland is. And of course, the exhibition also gave great kind of honour to the fact that lots of cultures and places were developing fabrics that look like tartan, because there's a strength in how the warp and the weft comes together, and there's an easy way to create colour through the different kind of strands that come in. But Scotland went for tartan for various reasons. So from the grid, we then looked at innovation, and we looked at how does it go from humble craft, how does it literally go from being on a loom in villages and a craft to being on the moon. You know, so the US astronaut took it to the moon. Then we start to get into very interesting territory looking at identity and how come tartan over centuries as a home on the back or the hips of somebody, a humble worker in the fields or a factory, as it is on punks and princesses, at home in football stadiums, as it is in the catwalk. So those complex ideas of duality start to come through, and how does the mainstream and the military and the establishment come to own it at the same time as very progressive subcultures. So those ideas of tartan start to come through, and then we started to look at the idea of power. So power through ideas around the British Empire and the way that tartan was used and traded, and picking up on some of the ideas that you're probably touching on there, Murray, but also power within conventional forms of royal families, soft power, diplomacy, military power, but also the power of youth culture and subculture and the punk movement and the work of designers like Vivienne Westwood and then others onto McQueen and then, you know, younger designers now. They end up having mainstream influence too. And then we ended in a section which looked at, I suppose, ideas of transcendental Scotland. And I think probably Billy and Murray both have strong ideas around this too. So I guess tartan is held, there's people have studied it, it's the most categorised textile on the planet. People go crazy for it, but with academic integrity as well as just loving how they wear it and what they can do with it. And it wasn't just a fashion show. We looked at the application of tartan across fashion, architecture, performance, everything. It's easily applied to, you know, plastic and souvenirs and merch, as anybody that's ever been in Edinburgh, you know, well knows. But I suppose what came through in transcendental tartan as the exhibition closed was really, really interesting ideas about who owns Scotland, what's myth, what's fact, what's legend, what's true. And that Scotland somehow as well, through a grid and many other kind of forms of cultural expression in its traditions, is held as a romantic and mystical place. So we looked at kind of certain filmmakers and other kind of ways of kind of expressing, and people that, like Dodie Weir, you know, the great rugby player who himself used tartan as he was battling an extremely challenging illness. He created a legend of himself through how he used his tartan. So lots of different moving ideas were swimming together in the exhibition. And of course, it also had Scotland's largest known and oldest fragment, the Glen Affric tartan, in it as well. So we were ever so proud of it. We think it contained lots of different ideas. It was incredibly well researched, and the design of the exhibition also kind of reinforced those ideas from grid all the way through. And now we are looking to take it out into the world, a huge step forward for V&A Dundee, but also we hope a huge step forward in how Scotland continues to communicate complex ideas that can coexist at the same time about its traditions, its innovations, and how it moves forward in these times as well as looking back. So we were very interested, I suppose, in the ideas of identity applied to different elements of material culture, fashion and beyond fashion in the exhibition.
Great, thank you. And it really does capture, the exhibition was wonderful, and it captured that past and future sense that we're talking about today. And I know you are also wearing the V&A tartan. And here we have the US Consul's tartan reflected on the poster behind us. So it is still very much a live thing. Billy, I'm going to turn to you now. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you have done on the history of Tartan Day? And then perhaps we'll go into Scottish diasporic identity as well, which I know Leonie has also mentioned.
Well, I made a three-part radio documentary series for Radio Scotland, which you can find on YouTube if you look for it. And I found fascinating material about the connections between Scotland and America relating to the Declaration, and going through to the present day, where a worker, a scientist in Silicon Valley, had a Scottish company called Shiltrom, which is the name of the army units that fought for the Bruce at the time of the Declaration of Independence, and he put the Declaration of Independence on a silicon chip. The whole of the Declaration there. I'm fascinated by the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment, that period in 18th century America, where Princeton College, for example, was a Presbyterian college in its origins, and the oldest building in Princeton, Nassau Hall, was funded by a collection at the Church of Scotland across Scotland on one Sunday in something like the 1750s. So there's a strong, strong connection. Witherspoon and signatories of the Declaration were brought up in that Presbyterian tradition and planted it in North America. There were around 15 books that published the Declaration of Arbroath, published and available to people in the colonies in America at that time. And James Boswell wrote a book about the movement for Corsican independence. And that was one of the popular books in America just before the American Revolution. And in his book, Corsica, the journal of a tour to that island and memoir of Pascal Paoli, A number of streets in some of the big cities at that time, like Philadelphia, were named after Paoli because of the success of Boswell's book. And when you open Boswell's book, the first thing you see is the line from the Declaration of Arbroath. We fight not for glory, nor for wealth, nor honours, but only and alone we fight for freedom. And Boswell, during his grand tour, Boswell's often regarded today as somebody with very mixed tension between his Scottish and his British identity. But in the grand tour, when he came across the Declaration of Arbroath in the university in Leipzig, he declaimed, "My fellows were struck with the noble sentiments at the liberty of the old Scots, and they expressed their regret at the shameful union. I felt too patriots' sorrow, O infamous rascals, who sold the honour of your country to a nation against which our ancestors supported themselves with so much glory. But I say no more but only, alas, poor Scotland." So this was the background to the Declaration of Arbroath that informed the early days of the United States. And there's a number of quotations like that which seem to me to echo the Declaration of Arbroath that were part of that cultural movement at the time of American independence.
Thank you. Murray, I'm going to come back to something you said earlier. You talked about invented tradition. And Leonie, you said, who owns Scotland? You asked the question. And could you say a little more, Murray, about that idea of an invented tradition and how that fits with the history and the future?
Oh.
Does it matter?
Well, I think one of the things, that Scotland is now in a different place than what it was 40 years ago in a number of ways. And one of the things, and Billy and I were just talking about the Scotch Myths exhibition, which takes us back to 1981, was there has been, which I think is now more or less exhausted, an absolute obsession, which is quite correct on a scholar level, for getting history correct. What is incorrect, really, or unhelpful, is presuming that the things that have grown up around history, the popular practices and beliefs, are themselves illegitimate in some way. They're like a history essay that's got it all wrong. But actually, they're a different thing. Because all cultures have a banality of how they talk to themselves about themselves and how they repeat who they are to themselves. And those may or may not have particularly good historical bases. So one of the key elements that Scotland has got, and it's wonderful to have the Cabinet Secretary with us tonight also to talk about this. I know it's something he thinks about very deeply. Is that people abroad who are of Scottish heritage or of Scottish affiliation have their own customs and traditions, and the United States is one of those. Have their own customs and traditions linked to the symbolic architecture of Scottishness, performing Scottishness. And they do it in different ways. And that doesn't mean that the ways they do it are wrong. That means that those are the ways they do it, and we should encounter them on that ground. And I think there's an awful lot in terms, which I'm aware of, in continental European performances of Scottishness. And indeed, I've been corrected in my Scottish performances in continental Europe as inauthentic, because that's the other thing. They adopt their own measures of authenticity. I don't think we encounter those, we understand those, and we reach out to those enough. And sometimes they even happen in your own country. So the very colourful and seated Bangladeshi Burns Supper in Glasgow is a classic example of that, whereas on the North American side of the sphere, there's nothing like processing under a dragon at Gung Haggis Fat Troy for Auld Lang Syne. And likewise in Slovenia, the joint celebration of Burns and Prešeren, the national poet. So these things can take so many different forms, and the interesting thing is, in the Scottish context, they can often take in hybrid forms which are united in some way with the domestic culture. And that's one of the very interesting things, or very slippery things, about what Scotland is globally. But Scotland is present globally And I think we need to engage with that in a lot more clarity and detail and awareness, and also, frankly, to rejoice in it.
Thank you. Billy, could I bring you in here also? What would you say to what Murray has raised, that question of authenticity, and also the idea of Scottish identities rather than identity, diasporic as well as homegrown?
The exhibition that Murray mentioned, I objected to a number of things that were going on in that exhibition because it didn't differentiate between what I consider to be the real Scottish culture and the kitsch version of it. So it had depictions like an image of Burns on a biscuit tin and saying this is kitsch. And I say, no, that's Robert Burns, one of the greatest poets in the history of the world, and certainly the most popular poet in the whole of the world, who produced wonderful, wonderful poetry. To link him with kitsch is nonsense. So separate the verkitched version of something and the real version of it. And we need to do that constantly. A lot of us weren't taught our own history in school, therefore a lot of us have to find our own voice. We were given strong oral traditions about Scottish culture, but very little physically taught in the schools. So there's that danger in a culture which often doesn't know its own history. There's a danger of kitsch taking over. But the strength of the culture is such that it could never completely take over. And I speak as someone who, the first day, I spent a year traveling around the world in 1975, and I hitchhiked from Vancouver to Cape Breton Island, and I wore the kilt, and I got picked up and put up by Scots from coast to coast in Canada. And the first Highland Games I ever went to was in Ingonish in Cape Breton Island. And I was aware of the strength of that identity as I was traveling. And it's a very, very positive thing. In the Scottish world, I talk about the fact that 99% of my experience as a Scot abroad is positive. And very few other countries could say that about their experience as a foreigner in a foreign land. So it is a thing to rejoice about. I was talking to you earlier about the difference between the Irish projection and the Scottish one. I think Tartan Day is a symbol of the Scots finally catching up with the chutzpah of the Irish and their projection in the United States, because Princeton's an example where Irish studies is taught in Princeton University, and there's very little Scottish studies, even though it was founded on the Scottish Enlightenment. And that's the difference between Scotland's status within the United Kingdom and Ireland's status as an independent nation, which projects that different, unique, independent culture to the rest of the world.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting about the Irish connection. I suppose we can come back to that in a moment in terms of talking about the future and Scottish identity abroad and Scottish diasporic identity. But Leonie, I wanted to see if you wanted to pick up on that idea of kitsch.
Yeah, I'd love to. Because I've got a slightly different view. So I know of the exhibition but didn't see it. So when we were doing our research, and some of the curators are there, so please correct me if I get this wrong. So we were very conscious of two exhibitions that had taken place. There was the Scotch Myths, curated by Murray Grigger, an incredible filmmaker, and as I understand it, the man that founded or coined the term Macintosh, and Charles J. Macintosh too. Then there was one at the Talbot Rice as well. Is that right? Yeah, thank you. But we also had conversations before we came out into these lovely armchairs earlier, and as a team at V&A Dundee, we were also thinking about, could you have done the sort of exhibition that we did with Tartan 10, 15, 20 years ago? And we all come from vaguely sort of different kind of generations, but I guess loosely all kind of one sort of larger generation. And so we felt we couldn't. We felt that people's understanding of kitsch, and there was a term that I remember hearing when I was younger and being really perplexed by it around cultural cringe in Scotland. So that, I suppose you're using the word rejoice in it. So I think we've come such a long way of people being concerned about the cringiness of their culture to really understanding that it can, that it is there's complications within it, but actually there's also brilliance within it, and those things. I think that the idea of those things coexisting and us resolving history through objects and stories, because their life stories keep changing too, is important. But I think I have a more favourable view of kitsch in that I love it, and that I think popular culture, which maybe is the habitat of kitsch, is as important as other more authorised cultures, I suppose. So I would always be really interested in any exhibition or research or inquiry that's looking at who gets to say what culture is. So the curatorial team in Tartan did a really brilliant thing with us where they came up with an idea called People's Tartan. And actually it didn't just bring in kitsch, because we were looking at kitsch as a kind of serious expression of identity that then travels the world, because it's often what's sold in the tourist shops as well as being made and produced around the world. So we were really happy and comfortable as a design museum that we felt, and that we felt that audiences from around the world and from Scotland would understand that it is okay to have the kitsch representation. So homemade trousers celebrating pop bands next to an Alexander McQueen dress. So there was that kind of level of juxtaposition within the objects we put together, and we were really happy that we were presenting a landscape of culture where we weren't giving all the answers. And I think that's an important thing that it's a mindset we have when we curate at V&A Dundee, that we're really committed to research, obviously, but we don't always give the answers. We like our exhibitions to also present the questions and give lots of different opportunities and options for how you respond to them. So I quite like kitsch. I think it is also a thing that matters in how we understand ourselves.
The difference is the way that you projected it.
Yeah.
I had no objections at all. I loved the Tartan exhibition.
Okay,
I took several groups of people to see the Tartan exhibition because there was nothing that jarred in it, the way a number of things jarred in that earlier exhibition.
Do you think that's
and I'm a big
though?
admirer of Murray,
Yeah.
and I know him personally, and I said that to him. It was just, but I think it was of its period, where people didn't know the difference. And
I think that's key, how things have changed over time. And there's a certain confidence also in being able to own kitsch and various versions of Scottishness.
I think if I may, this is quite Dundee rich, this meeting today. But I may invoke another Dundonian. It's Callum Colvin has actually done a great deal to repurpose the notion of kitsch into Scottish cultural representation. So I think there have been a lot of people working to change the boundaries, which seem to be so stark in the days of the shortbread tin accusations and the use of them as a prop in such exhibitions.
Yeah, right. So we're talking about an historical event, the Declaration of Arbroath, and the links that Tartan Day has to that. But how can Tartan Day also help us to shape Scotland's future, both at home and abroad? If I'll start with you, Murray.
So I think one of the things is that I love Tartan Day and I love Tartan Week in America. But I think one of the things is that the footprint is not always, or has not always been, as broad as it could be. One of the things I did in a few years ago was curate Glasgow's contribution to the Dubai Expo 21. And one of the things that really struck me was the bit where we did space. That was the bit that got picked up by the international media in huge volume that day. And that was because nobody expects Scotland to do anything with space. Space is just when you're hungry, you need a haggis. Scotland doesn't do... So surprising people with what Scotland can do, I think that there's more of that's possible. And I think there's some really good examples in the US, and I'll give you just one. So many years ago, I did a joint conference on Scottish and global culture at Berkeley. And it was co-sponsored by the St. Andrew's Society of San Francisco. And they all turned up to a special concert event, which was part of the conference. Didn't want to go to the papers, obviously. They had all got these kind of Theodore Napier great plaids on. They came in, they looked for all the world like, you know, the gentle Achille's grandfather, you know, being called in to talk to Cromwell's Ironsides. Lovely, fantastic, picturesque. But today, their meetings are regularly geared towards discussing aspects of modern Scottish culture and the economy. And it's one of the most interesting Scottish societies in the US because it's completely switched in less than 20 years. And that, I think, is something we want to have a much bigger footprint of, without prescribing it, without saying you've got to talk about this, modern Scotland. But we need to ensure that the breadth, the old and the new coexist, and we make the most of that in Tartan Week. When I was a student, which was a couple of years back, the Scots magazine didn't publish anything about Scotland that happened after 1800 because basically nothing did, and anyway, no one wants to know about it. And there's still something of that in the brand of Scotland overseas, and quietly expanding it without putting an end to it is, I think, one of the great purposes of Scotland's engagement abroad.
Thank you.
As recently as the early 2000s, I was one of the people who played for Scotland at the Smithsonian event in the mall, in the National Mall in Washington, D.C., the great folklore festival. And there were craftspeople, there were singers like Kathryn Porter, there were musicians, there were dancers, there was ladies from Sanker who made this special kind of knitwear gloves that I then went and bought for my family. It was an amazing gathering of people. And I think about 1.5 million people visit the mall. And everyone valued what we were doing. And on the Sunday, a newspaper was brought in, and it was the Glasgow Herald, and it said, "Brigadoon on the Potomac." That was the headline. And this, you couldn't get more real examples. There was a yawl builder from Shetland, etc., etc. You couldn't have gotten more real examples of Scottish culture. But that mentality of the kitsch, anything Scottish was kitsch. Therefore, this was Brigadoon on the Potomac. It was totally wrong, and I'm afraid that cringe still existed very strongly there. To counter that, and very importantly, is the goodwill that's there. A quote from Andrew Carnegie from Fife, which to me sums up the attitude of Scots in America. When Carnegie applied for work in Pittsburgh in 1870, and he was asked, "Are you native born?" He replied, "No, sir, I am a Scotchman." Later in life, he recalled the incident and wrote that it made him feel as proud as ever Roman did when it was their boast to say, "I am a Roman citizen." Now contrast that confidence in the identity, knowledge of that great educational tradition of the democratic intellect that his weaver ancestors had belonged to. Contrast that with Brigadoon in the Potomac. And as I say, my experience of travelling in the Scottish world has been very, very positive. One story that sums it up. My friend Bill, who later published my books, and I spent a year 75 travelling around the world. We're about 24. And I arrived from Southeast Asia in Honolulu, and we were desperate for a good visa that would allow us to stay in the United States, where we had friends from the University of California who would help us get work. We arrived in Honolulu International Airport, and as we approached immigration, Bill noticed an attractive young female immigration official, and he always had a thing for the ladies, Bill, and he decided he would go into that queue. I noticed a big guy, big stoot guy, with the name tag MacLeod. And I said, "I'm going into that queue, Bill." Bill went up to the young lady, he engaged her in eye contact. She noticed that his pupils were dilated. He had just flown in from Bangkok. He ended up being strip searched for drugs in Honolulu International Airport, and he was given a 3-month visa for the United States. I went up to Mr. MacLeod and said, I can't help but notice your name. I visited Dunvegan Castle a few months ago before I left Scotland. I told him about Eilenach Yaw, about Anchelan Skianach. I almost sung him a Gaelic lullaby, and he fell in love with me there in Honolulu International Airport. He gave me a 9-month visa. So there's the moral of the story. Don't rely on fleeting good looks, gentlemen, when you've got the strength of the Scottish card to play.
No. I think it's very interesting what you were saying about the folkloric and how it was not always, people weren't always as proud of that as they could be abroad. But do you think there's been a real shift recently, that there is a celebration of the tradition along with sort of ownership and confidence, talking about Scottish Enlightenment, but also, and Leonie, if I can talk to you about this, or turn to you, Scotland's sort of design footprint in the world is also strong. So is there a sense that Scotland is increasingly perceived as all of these things? So if I turn to you first, but maybe I'll come back to you, Billy and Mary also.
Yes, I think so. It's a complicated. It's a big question. So in terms of Scotland's design footprint, I suppose if one were to spend time analysing and charting the forming of the United States as we know it, the innovators, the engineers, the inventors of Scotland that also were natural travellers and settlers. So Scotland, because of its coastal communities, has always looked out as well as stayed put. It's done both, and that's kind of made the Scotland that we understand it. I do think there is more confidence in Scotland, and I guess a really easy example for people to understand that with are around fashion. So there is evidence from the catwalk and through what influential people wear over decades and centuries around the use of tartan, but in their own hands, if you like. So even the Dior cruise collection that launched at Drummond Castle in Perthshire last June, that's 50 years on-ish from Dior doing a Scottish collection before, major show, huge investment in Scotland, connecting to makers and artisans and people that hold not only craft as a technical ability, but craft as knowledge from Scotland, all contributing to that Dior show. So yeah, I think there's definitely increasing confidence, and I really do mean what I say earlier when I said I don't know if you could have done the Tartan show with such, and I'm not meaning that's because V&A Dundee did. I don't know if Scotland could have had the confidence to tell those stories and also to deal with some of the really difficult histories that tartan often was a symbol of and attached to in many ways too. So, we've come a long way, not just in terms of our confidence in the multiple identities that Scotland has, but also I think in terms of understanding the good and the bad that we've generated in the world, and the relationship between all of that. And I think, tartan is this incredible textile. It's an incredible day where actually they're lightning rods for all these conversations, and that's fascinating. And I would agree with Murray that I think in terms of the role of Tartan Day in a contemporary understanding of a modern Scotland, I guess is what we're talking about here, is that I think as long as we all understand the Tartan Days that happen around the world, where they are the places where maybe people's understanding of what might be they should be continual inventors of traditions. I think it's okay for us to think of it like that, as well as invented traditions. But I would advocate, like I think you were advocating for this, that the contemporary has to sit alongside those ideas of tradition.
Great, thank you. I don't know if Murray or Billy wants to add anything to that.
I want to add to that it's time for everyone to join us at the reception. That's what I'd like to add.
Wonderful. So if I can ask you to join me in thanking our speakers, Murray, Leonie and Billy, and I'm sure as we move into the reception, which is in the room next door, we can continue this conversation about the past and future of Tartan Day, and I think Scotland's confident future at home and abroad. Thank you very much. Thank you.